Tomorrow, February 17th, 2026, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia will sit down together in Geneva, Switzerland, for the third round of peace talks aimed at ending the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. This is the first time these negotiations have moved to European soil. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff will lead the American delegation. The talks come just 1 week before the 3-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, a war that has killed over 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers by Zelensky's own count, displaced nearly 10 million people, and caused $524 billion in damage. Both sides say 90% of a 20-point peace plan has been agreed. The remaining 10% is the hardest part: territory. This is everything you need to know before the talks begin. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 3 years later, the human cost is staggering. Zelensky disclosed on February 5 that 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Independent estimates put the real number between 100,000 and 140,000, with total casualties including wounded and missing reaching up to 600,000. On the Russian side, Ukraine's general staff claims over 1.25 million total Russian casualties. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said at the Munich Security Conference that Russia lost 35,000 men in December 2025 alone, and another 30,000 in January. He called them crazy losses, and said at this rate, losses will inevitably reach Moscow and St. Petersburg. Nearly 6 million Ukrainians are refugees abroad, and another 3.7 million are displaced inside the country. Russia now controls about 20% of Ukraine's territory, roughly 46,000 square miles. The front line stretches 750 miles. Russian forces continue to advance slowly but relentlessly, gaining 182 square miles in just the last month. Both sides are exhausted. Both sides are running out of options, and both sides have finally agreed to talk. The path to Geneva started in Abu Dhabi. On January 23, 2026, something happened that had never occurred since the war began. The United States, Ukraine, and Russia sat down together in the same room for structured trilateral negotiations. Ukraine sent Rustem Umerov, the Secretary of the National Security Council. Russia sent Vladimir Medinsky, Putin's advisor and the same man who led failed peace talks in Turkey back in 2022. America's Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, mediated. They discussed a revised 20-point plan covering territory, economy, and security. They talked about a possible buffer zone and ceasefire monitoring. No breakthrough was reached, but Washington called the mood very upbeat. The most significant outcome was that the U.S. and Russia agreed to re-establish military dialogue for the first time since the invasion. Then in late January, during a brutal cold snap that pushed temperatures to -20 Celsius, Trump personally asked Putin to stop bombing Kiev's energy grid. Russia briefly paused strikes on the capital, but Zelensky was clear: there is no ceasefire. There is no official agreement. Russia resumed attacks days later. Round 2 returned to Abu Dhabi on February 4th. This time, something concrete happened. Both sides agreed to a prisoner exchange of 314 prisoners of war, the first such exchange in 5 months. It was a genuine confidence-building measure that proved incremental agreements were possible even without resolving the big questions. Witkoff said delegations had extensive discussions on outstanding issues, including ways to implement a ceasefire and monitor it. The U.S. proposed a temporary halt to energy attacks. Zelensky said Ukraine was ready for an energy truce but received no response from Russia. Quote, "We received responses in the form of drones and missile attacks," end quote. All sides called the talks constructive, but the core issues remained untouched. What would happen to the 20% of Ukraine that Russia controls? Would Ukraine give up its dream of joining NATO? Would Russia accept European troops on Ukrainian soil? These were the questions that Round 2 could not answer. These are the questions that Geneva must confront. To understand what happens in Geneva, you need to understand what each side is demanding. Ukraine wants a freeze along the current front lines, not formal recognition of Russian annexation. Zelensky said at Munich that it would be an illusion to believe this war can be reliably ended by dividing Ukraine. He compared it to the 1938 Munich Agreement. Ukraine wants security guarantees of at least 20 years. The U.S. offered 15. Zelensky wants 20, 30, even 50. He wants a path to EU membership by 2027 and European troops on the ground after a ceasefire. Russia wants the opposite. Putin demands Ukraine withdraw from all of Donetsk and Luhansk. He wants international recognition of Russia's control over Crimea and all 4 annexed oblasts. He demands Ukraine enshrine in its constitution that it will never join NATO. He wants all Western sanctions lifted and no European troops anywhere in Ukraine. There is a massive gap between these positions. Zelensky himself acknowledged the disconnect at Munich, saying sometimes it feels like the sides are talking about completely different things. One of the most significant developments heading into Geneva happened on January 6th in Paris. 35 countries signed a declaration committing to Ukraine's post-war security. France and the United Kingdom pledged to deploy several thousand troops on Ukrainian soil after a ceasefire. The security framework includes ceasefire monitoring with drones, sensors, and satellites led by the U.S., a multinational ground force led by France and Britain, and a legally binding obligation to assist Ukraine if Russia reinvades. This is the most concrete Western military commitment to Ukraine since the war began. At Munich, NATO defense ministers announced a $500 million military aid package, including $200 million from Britain for air defense missiles. But Russia has repeatedly ruled out any presence of NATO forces in Ukraine after a deal. Kremlin spokesperson Peskov made this unambiguous. This puts the coalition directly at odds with Russia's red line, and it is one of the most difficult issues that Geneva will have to navigate. So why does this round matter more than the first two? First, it is the first time talks have moved to European soil. Abu Dhabi was neutral but distant. Geneva signals that Europe has a direct stake in the outcome. Second, Kremlin spokesperson Peskov said Geneva will cover a wider range of issues, including the most difficult one, territories. Previous rounds avoided this. Third, both Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff will attend. Kushner's first appearance at trilateral talks signals that Trump is personally invested. Fourth, Russia expanded its delegation to include Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin alongside Medinsky, suggesting Moscow may be prepared for more substantive discussions. Fifth, the United States has imposed a June 2026 deadline on both sides to reach a deal. Geneva is the midway checkpoint. And sixth, something remarkable is happening on the battlefield. Just hours before talks begin, Ukraine launched what was described as the heaviest drone attack since the war started, striking Russian energy infrastructure in Krasnodar and Bryansk. Russia destroyed over 220 drones in a 12-hour barrage. Both sides are escalating to negotiate from positions of demonstrated strength. The battlefield and the negotiating table are now running in parallel. Behind the scenes, the framework of a deal is taking shape. In November, U.S. envoy Witkoff and Russia's Kirill Dmitriev developed a 28-point plan. It proposed that Ukraine cede parts of Donetsk it hasn't yet lost and receive back some territory near Kharkiv. The U.S. would recognize Russian control of Donbas, Crimea, and parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson as de facto Russian. Ukraine would enshrine NATO non-membership in its constitution, but could join the EU. A coalition of the willing would provide security guarantees. European allies pushed back hard, calling the plan overly favorable to Russia. Since then, the plan has been revised into a 20-point version. After meeting Trump at Mar-a-Lago on December 28, Zelensky said 90% of it was agreed, and the U.S.-Ukraine security guarantee document was 100% ready to sign. The remaining 10% centers on territory and the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies warn this could be a strategic trap if territorial concessions aren't backed by ironclad security guarantees. A retired four-star general believes the most realistic outcome is not peace, but a pause in the war. The question is whether a pause is enough. Tomorrow morning in Geneva, Witkoff and Kushner will first hold separate talks on Iran's nuclear program, then shift to the Ukraine negotiations in the afternoon. Ukraine's delegation is led by Kyrylo Budanov, the 39-year-old former head of military intelligence who posted on his way to Geneva. The next round of negotiations is ahead. Along the way, we will discuss the lessons of our history with our colleagues and seek the right conclusions. Russia's Medinsky and newly added Deputy Foreign Minister Galuzin represent Moscow. The talks will run through Wednesday. The 3-year anniversary of the invasion falls 1 week later on February 24th. If Geneva produces a framework, it would be the first real step toward ending the deadliest European conflict since 1945. If it fails, the war continues into its 4th year with no end in sight, casualties mounting on both sides, and the June deadline looming. $524 billion in damage, 10 million displaced lives, over 1 million casualties on both sides combined. The world will be watching Geneva tomorrow. The question is whether 3 years of destruction has finally been enough to force both sides to compromise on the 10% they cannot agree on. This video was published on February 16, 2026, the day before the Geneva talks begin. I will be covering the outcome as it develops. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the update. What do you think? Can Ukraine and Russia actually reach a deal, or is this just another pause before more war? Let me know in the comments.